Welcome to the 135th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with James Thompson, author of Helsinki Blood, the latest in the Inspector Vara series. One technical note about this interview: I normally don't discuss the technology or the behind the scenes of production of these podcasts, but I did want to let you know that in interviewing James Thompson, I normally use Skype, and Skype was being very temperamental that day. So I'm uploading the interview. I still think it's a great interview, but just wanted to give you the heads up that please bear with the audio quality a couple of times during the interview. But it's a great interview, and stay tuned for the interview with James Thompson, author of Helsinki Blood. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Jim Thompson. Jim's latest novel is Helsinki Blood, the fourth crime novel featuring Inspector Kari Vara. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Well, I wondered if you could read the prologue to your new novel, Helsinki Blood.
All right. Prologue, July 11th, a hot summer Sunday. All I want is some goddamn peace and quiet. Now my house is under siege. I have an infant to both care for and protect, and I'm forced to do the last thing I wanted to do, call Sweetness and Milo, my colleagues and subordinates, or accomplices. The definition of their role in my life depends on one's worldview, and ask them for help. I'm shot to pieces, bullets to my knees and jaw. Places I've been shot before have left me a wreck. Only cortisone shots and dope for pain enable me to get around with a cane, speak and eat without wanting to scream. I'm still recovering from a brain tumor removal 6 months ago. The operation was a success, but had a serious side effect that left me flat, emotionless. My feelings are returning as the empty space where once a tumor existed fills in with new tissue, but I only feel love for my wife and child, an intermittent like for one or two others. My normal state and reaction toward others is now irritability. My wife, Kate, suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and has run away from home out of control of her own emotions and abandoned me. These combined problems, any one of which would drive a person to distraction under the best of circumstances, cloud my judgment and affect my behavior. My judgment and behavior were already clouded. I feel so certain it will all end badly that it all seems more a portent than an emotion. Auguries and omens of catastrophe seem all around me, just out of sight, but every time I turn to face them, they disappear like apparitions.
Great. Well, if the listeners haven't heard about your new novel yet, Helsinki Blood, how would you describe the novel?
Pitch black noir.
Great. Well, I know that you're an American and you've lived in Finland for 15 years, and Finland is the setting for your Inspector Vara novels. What was your writing journey that led you to writing crime novels set in Finland? Were you always writing when you were younger?
Oh, yeah. That's a quite strange story because, people typically work very, very hard to get published. Excuse me, I'm sipping coffee.
Sure.
And I started writing regularly on October 16th, 1994. That's when I got my first computer. I didn't really know what to do with it. I've always been involved in the arts in one way or another, and also a very avid reader. And, most books suck. and well, it gets aggravating if you read a book every day or two, and most of them aren't worth the paper they're printed on. And I was getting so mad, I started a book, read 15 or 50 pages, and just take it and throw it at the wall. So I thought, well, I will try to write a book that I would like to read. And unfortunately, I found out that I was like someone who likes to eat, who assumes that means he can cook. It's just not true. So I had to back up a few years and teach myself the craft of writing. And I moved here in, what was it, February of 98, something like that. And it somewhat estranged me from my own language, from my mother tongue, because, you know, I'm in a Finnish-speaking country and I spoke no Finnish. And I think it made writing all the more important to me, and I became very compulsive about it. But I was told when I finished my first novel that, no, my second novel, my first novel got no attention. It sits on a shelf where I can see it now, and it got no attention because, like most novels, it was unpublishable. But my second novel actually was published here in Finland, and it's pretty good, but it was it got the attention of a very good literary agent in the States, but when he sent it to publishers, they told him it was the subject matter and my treatment of the themes were just too cold and hard for the American market. And I said, well, what am I going to do here? I can either pander and write something I don't want to write, or do what I did because for the reason I got into this in the first place, and write because I want to write something I want to like.
Sure.
So I kept writing the way I wanted to, and at the time I had started the university and working on a master's degree, and writing sort of took second place, but I was always constantly writing anyways. I wrote a second book, and I was working in a bar. I worked in bars, or mostly nightclubs, actually, almost all my life. And I was talking to a guy, and I didn't know that he was a managing editor for an imprint of Northern Europe's largest publisher. And we were just talking about fiction, and I didn't push it on him. I just sort of came out that I write. I hadn't really thought about it being published in a long time. I belonged to writers groups and things like that. I was involved with the local writing community, but it's kind of funny. I sort of even discouraged him. I told him what had been said to me in answers from publishers, which wasn't bad. I mean, the overall message. I remember this wasn't long after 9/11, so it was a time when they were even putting like Arnold Schwarzenegger movies in the can and sitting on them, because reality had superseded fiction for a time, and this was a novel set in Jerusalem, and at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's a harsh book, and he asked to read it. I'm like, okay, sure. So I gave him the manuscript, and within a few weeks we had a deal. And of course I've been writing all those years, and so I had other books as well. And I gave him a one-page synopsis of another book, and he bought it off the page. And not long after that, I finished Snow Angels. And what's our profanity level here?
Oh, it's fine. It's fine.
I handed him the manuscript and said, "I finished this book if you want to read it," even though I was still unpublished. So he took it home, and the next time I saw him, he was sitting outside having a cognac and a cigar, and he says, "I fucking hate you. God damn you. Do you realize that you have just destroyed the goddamn genre of writing crime fiction in the Arctic for the next 10 years?"
And why did he say that?
and well, that meant a book contract. I had a 3-book contract, and as far as fiction goes, at least, that had never happened in Finland before, and certainly never to a foreigner. So it was a quite odd situation. And then it wasn't that long later. My first book had come out, the one set in Jerusalem. I remember that. But a New York power agent heard about me through a mutual acquaintance. And this acquaintance told him he might want to consider reading this book. And being as the situation was then, and I suppose to some extent still remains, they were scouring the planet, well, not the planet, the top of the planet, looking for the next Stieg Larsson, you know.
Right, exactly.
And there was no Finnish representative in the Scandinavian crime wave. Now it's called Nordic noir. Back then it was the Scandinavian crime wave. So he says, "Tell Jim Thompson to send me that book right now." And 4 days later, now, you know, it usually takes like a few months to get any kind of response from an agent. 4 days later, I get an email that says, "I want to represent this book in all your future works." So independently, I built careers on both sides of the big water.
That's great. So earlier you mentioned how when you first started writing and you'd written this first novel, which you said was unpublishable, that you had to kind of go back and teach yourself how to write. What was that process like for you? Because I know that a lot of writers, when they sit down to write their first novel, or they never make it because they realize that it's a lot harder than they thought. So what was the process like for you?
Well, I actually just worked on one novel. I worked on one novel for 7 years. So, for me, yeah, it was very enjoyable process. This was back before, and I had a great deal of fun with it. But luckily, I think no writer is really capable of judging his or her own writing. But I realized for a long time that all I was producing was trash, and I was throwing my own stuff at the wall. But that was okay because I was having a good time with it. So I think it just depends on your personality, and your motivations for what you're doing. If you're writing for the love of writing, then it doesn't really matter if you're published or not, does it?
Right, right. So I just wanted to ask as well, what led you originally to move to Finland from America?
I chased a girl here.
Gotcha.
She's
And
gone. I'm here. I'm married to a Finnish woman when I met many years after I came here.
right, right.
So,
And I'm curious, what has the reception been in Finland to your novels?
um, I just wrote a quite long interview for Elizabeth White about this because it's changed over time. Um, well, largely because my writing has changed over time. Um, can you tell me what books of mine you've read, if any?
I'm about halfway through Helsinki Blood.
Okay. Well, it's a pretty harsh book. Um, my first book set in Finland, Snow Angels, is a more sympathetic book. Even that is, people didn't know what to think of it. Um, uh, as an outsider, I had lived here for many years before I wrote that book, and the observer has the cold eye, where if you grow up somewhere, you don't see the trees for the forest. And I pride myself on trying to tell Finns things they don't recognize about themselves in writing. And uh, in fact, that book in particular is really just a variation. These are the primary themes of Finnish art and literature, and always have been. But for an outsider to say them, I took a little bit of flack. Uh, I remember one blogger saying, "Now no tourists are ever going to want to come here." But um, I write dark fiction. I mean, if someone else wants to write warm stories about Christmas time, uh, that's great. And those stories would be true as well. But we do have problems with depression and alcoholism and murder and suicide. And there's a lot of truth in my stories as well. So it's like anywhere you live, there's two sides to every place. I've been around quite a bit, and from not just 1 kilometer to another, but one apartment to another, life is very different. Everyone's life experiences are different.
Sure,
And
sure.
uh, well,
Have you considered at this point of possibly writing a novel or story set in America, or do you feel like you're too removed from it and you would prefer to stay with Finland for now?
Elizabeth Elizabeth asked me the same thing, and um, I was away from there for a decade, and I went back in 2009, and I grew up in Appalachian, Kentucky, although I've lived in major cities. I lived in Boston for quite a few years, and uh, it was like being in a foreign country for me. And I wouldn't be. I'm. I'm no longer acclimated to America. I'm acclimated to Finland, and I would not be able to write a book about American life as it is today for most people, at least in urban centers. I mean, the place has just changed very much. And
Sure, sure. Do you
that's
remember? Go
what
ahead.
places do. Um, you don't. It's another thing you don't see if you stare at it constantly. America, it felt very different to me. My perceptions of it, like I remember being in Times Square. I hadn't been there in like 20 years. I felt like I was in Blade Runner. Uh, I had this sort of surreal feeling the whole time I was in New York. But you were saying,
I was just going to ask, do you remember what gave you the original idea or inspiration for Inspector Vara before you wrote Snow Angels?
uh, it struck me between the eyes, as Colonel Kurt said, like a diamond bullet. Uh, I pictured the opening scene of Snow Angels, and it's a black woman who's been horrifically slaughtered in a snowfield on a reindeer farm. And in just almost an instant, I knew why she was there, who had killed her and why, and I knew who the protagonist was. And um, it all came together very quickly. As far as books go, it was a fairly easy one for me to write.
Great. Well, I'm curious. You talked earlier about this first novel that you worked on for 7 years as you were trying to kind of figure out your how to write, so to speak. What made you eventually kind of leave that novel and move on in terms of working on other projects and other novels and stories? Was there a specific incident, or did you just eventually just put that away? And I was just wondering what that decision was for you.
It was just done. There was nothing more I could do with it. I've taken it as far as my skill level would allow. Some of the writing in it's pretty good, but it has structural problems. And, after 7 years, uh, a person needs to move on.
Sure, sure. So what is your writing process like now? Do you have a specific workflow, or do you outline extensively, or are you more of an organic writer?
Um, I do outline, but I do the vast majority of it in my head. Um, I first book I sold, uh, uh, the first one published. I think it's 100, partly because they, after they had bought 3 books, they had invested a great deal of money in me. And do you know the term branding as far as being an author goes?
Sure, sure. Hmm.
They decided that I was to be a branded author, and they asked me if I could produce 4 books in 3 years. I said, yes, I can. But, just because I have a book here, for instance, the book set in Jerusalem, that was written by an American, and I was on my way to becoming a Nordic writer. And so all the books were torn apart except for Snow Angels, because it's was written in a very finished way, anyways. But those first two, which are standalone thrillers, had to be torn to bits, rebuilt, and designed for a Nordic demographic. And actually, that's the best thing that could have happened to me. My managing editor, I remember he bought the book, but he gave it back to me, and he says, you got this guy and your protagonist here, and he's a stone sociopath. He likes killing people. It doesn't bother him, yet you put in this boo-hoo-hoo stuff, which is, it's very American, and it's not very appealing, and it doesn't ring true. So why don't you take this book home and rewrite it and bring it back to me once you've written the truth of this story? And I did exactly that. And that was the best advice anybody ever gave me. Just write the truth of the story. So, now I've lost my train of thought. Was there,
So that kind of leads into my next question. What advice would you have for aspiring writers who are trying to write their own stories and their own novels?
I would advise them to consider what they're doing and why. A writer's life's very hard. You asked me about working. I work 7 days a week. I start as soon as I get out of bed. So I'm reading my research materials on my way to sleep. Once people actually start reading your stuff and you have deadlines and books to sell, there's a lot of people that are depending on you, and it's stuff that no one else can do. No one can help you. And the road to learning the craft of writing is difficult. This is part of the problem. And for instance, now there's over 1 million self-published books on Amazon. I would guess that 99.8% of them are just awful. But people believe, because they have some gift with the English language, that also makes them a good storyteller. And it's a combination of a number of factors that make a good writer. And it takes some years to learn the craft of writing, just as it does to learn to play the concert piano. Just because you can speak doesn't mean you can write. Going back to the eating thing, it doesn't mean you can cook. So I think that they should realize that they're lonely hours, and if you're not a person who embraces solitude, who is willing to give up relationships and those fun times their buddies are out having, doing, well, I shouldn't say frivolous stuff, but sports or whatever else, that those are things that they're not going to be able to do anymore. If they're going to succeed as writers, they're going to have to dedicate themselves to this craft, and it's going to eat up their lives. And the better they get, the more it's going to eat them up. And so, first of all, they're likely going to fail, especially in the crime and thriller genres. I would say something like 100,000 writers achieves any degree of success success. I think the average published writer makes 1,000. Except the satisfaction of the process. The process is everything. And you know, you can be involved in another art form, like say you can play guitar and you can sing a little bit, or you can paint a little bit, and you have something to show for it. With writing, it's not like that. You just sit there and bleed into the keyboard, and until you're published, people think you're just involved in some kind of foolishness. You're just a jackass with a stupid hobby. So I would first advise people to very carefully consider their motivations and this preoccupation with publication, I think, is a terrible mistake. That there are, much like people who like to sit and play the guitar, they don't necessarily care if they become Jimmy Page. They just like to play the guitar. It's okay to just like to write. But because of this stigma involved in being an unpublished, technically you should have 2 books published by a major or a recognized publisher before you're officially an author. But this thing about being a jackass with a hobby, you know, it's people, they just want to go, look, Ma, there's my book. It's on sale on Amazon. I'm an author now. Well, guess what? You're not. You've produced a text, but it doesn't mean that you've accomplished anything. That said, anyone who has the fortitude to sit there for the 1,000 to 2,000 hours it takes to produce a book, I respect that, whether it's a good book or a bad book. But people just shouldn't expect to gain anything from it. I mean, I didn't, obviously.
Right. So what are you working on now?
Well, some of it's top secret government information. I'm not allowed to talk about, but I have just got a 2-book deal with Putnam, my publisher, for the next 2 in the Inspector Vada series, which will make a total of 6, and that's going to keep me busy through 2015. And I'm also managing editor of an anthology of Finnish crime writers that's to be published. It's going to be translated and published as part of the award-winning series by Akashic in the States, and it will also be published here in Finland. And I got another couple of things on the back burner. I stay pretty busy.
That's great. When is that anthology slated for publication? Do you know?
Well, it'll be a little different in the States and in Finland because of just the way things work.
Sure.
But the big money in the book world all trades hands, not all of it, but a huge part of it, at the Frankfurt Book Fair every October in Germany. And in 2014, Finland is the theme of the book fair. So that's what we're really gearing toward.
Right.
Both countries need to work on their own time schedules to get the book out and get it publicized, get some reviews. You know, there's a balance here between getting some publicity, and so you have some sales tools, and letting your book get too old. So both countries will work their different versions of magic in that way. The book is actually written. I've already been through all the stories. Great. So we're going to the translation process right now.
And where can people find you online if they're interested in learning more about your books?
I'm everywhere. There's my website, jamesthompsonauthor.com. I've got 2 Facebook sites, Twitter. I'm very active on Goodreads. And I answer every email that anyone writes to me. It's just, I try to make myself accessible to people who want to communicate with me. I've also got film deals, and I'm co-screenwriter. So the first 3 books in the Vada series have been optioned for film.
Great. Well, it sounds like you're staying busy.
Yeah, and if you read that book there's a Helsinki Blood. There's a setting called Hirpiähauki, which is a bar. I worked in that bar for 6 years, and if I go somewhere to hang out, that's generally where you find me.
Well, great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Jim Thompson, author of Helsinki Blood, the 4th Inspector Vara novel. Helsinki Blood is available in bookstores now, so check it out. Jim, thanks for doing the interview.
Please let me point out that in the States, I'm published under the name James Thompson.
Correct. James Thompson. And
there's a dead writer guy who's actually a phenomenal writer named Jim Thompson. We get mixed up on the web browser sometimes,
Sure. So
anyway,
yes, again, the books are published under James Thompson. I'll have links to those in the show notes so you can check them out. And thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.